The public knew the Royal Foundation as a symbol of generosity, but behind closed doors, whispers began to circulate, anonymous tips, hesitant murmurs among long-time aides, and one name surfacing again and again: Princess Anne. What had she seen? And why was she no longer willing to stay silent? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It started small numbers on a page that didn't quite add up. But when those numbers pointed toward the personal trust accounts tied to Charles himself, Anne's alarm didn't remain silent. What appeared to be minor clerical inconsistencies quickly spiraled into what could only be called financial misdirection. During a routine quarterly review of Royal Foundation expenditures, Anne, known for her meticulous eye and refusal to sign off without full clarity, flagged a paper trail that diverged from the official charity summaries. When she pressed for answers, what she got in return was silence, and then a sudden reshuffling of internal access permissions. That was her first signal. Something was being hidden, and not by accident. Within weeks, 2 senior royal aides resigned unexpectedly. Their public statements cited health and family, but palace insiders whispered of pressure to stay quiet. Anne, growing more unsettled, approached Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, with a quiet but loaded remark. This will shake the crown more than anything else. She didn't ask questions. She simply listened. The rift between Anne and Charles hadn't exploded into the open, but its presence became a shadow in every council room they entered together. Anne's questions were met with vague reassurances. Her access was slowly reduced, and the Royal Foundation's financial summaries became more carefully curated with every passing quarter. Even as public appearances maintained the illusion of unity, the royal household began to operate under an air of silent tension. Behind the formality and tradition, the reality was unraveling. Princess Anne had stumbled onto something that threatened not just Charles's image, but the monarchy's entire moral foundation. The sums in question weren't pocket change. They were tied to international donations, disaster relief funds, and education programs that now seemed to have quietly vanished. Anne knew what that meant. She knew that history wouldn't care about good intentions if money meant for the people had been used to fortify private empires. And so, with each unanswered question and each closed door, Anne stopped asking. She started documenting. The choice wasn't easy. The crown had withstood scandal before affairs, divorces, even abdications. And if the numbers were right, then what Charles had permitted, ignored, or authorized would shake the public's trust more than any personal failing ever could. But Anne didn't leak to the press, not yet. She went somewhere far more dangerous first, straight to Charles himself. It wasn't a public showdown. No cameras, no press, just a private meeting in Clarence House, locked doors, and words exchanged that would never be forgotten. Anne came prepared. Charles came defensive. What began as a conversation ended as a warning. Anne had requested the meeting under the familiar pretense of family business, a phrase often used to avoid setting off alarms in the palace. But what she carried into that room wasn't gossip or concern, it was evidence. Quiet, damning, undeniable. Documents, digital printouts, and notations that traced a financial pattern no one could casually explain. Funds routed through obscure accounts, donors unaccounted for, transactions masked as project costs, but never materializing in actual impact. Anne laid them out methodically, one by one, like a case built over months. And then she waited. Charles, at first, said nothing. Then he dismissed it all as accounting noise, a phrase that stung not because it was condescending, but because it revealed something deeper he knew. He knew there were gaps, but he'd decided they were manageable, ignorable, survivable. Anne's silence in response wasn't passive, it was boiling restraint. She made it clear that her loyalty had a line, and this crossed it. Protecting the monarchy did not mean protecting wrongdoing. Not anymore. Not when public trust had become fragile. Not when the future rested on credibility, not ceremony. When Charles reiterated that this wasn't her role, Anne didn't flinch. "It is now," she answered, calm, final, unshaken. That moment rewrote something unspoken between them. The bond of siblings, forged over decades of royal duty, fractured not in anger, but in principle. From that day forward, their relationship, at least behind palace walls, was no longer united. They would appear side by side when required. They would wave, they would bow, but the trust was gone. In the silence that followed, Charles didn't ask for the documents. He didn't deny their contents. He simply stood, as if trying to reclaim the ground Anne had taken, but it was too late. She had crossed the line from concerned sister to principled adversary, and there was no going back. What made the encounter more dangerous was its secrecy. No aides, no notes, no official record. Just memory, tension, and implication. But Anne walked away from Clarence House with something Charles no longer had: moral clarity. And with that came resolve. Because if the monarchy was to survive this, not just as an institution, but as a symbol, it couldn't be shielded from its own truths. Not by her, not anymore. And while the palace remained silent, Anne's next move wouldn't stay in the shadows. A single ledger hidden among archived charity records told a different story than the one Charles's foundation had published. Funds intended for disaster relief, education programs, veterans, reallocated. Anne didn't just find discrepancies, she found names. The document was inconspicuous at first glance, tucked between routine filings and donor acknowledgements. But upon closer inspection, it was riddled with red flags, transactions that didn't match their descriptions, figures that mirrored no public report, and handwritten notations that contradicted the official narrative. In one column, a grant meant for post-flood rehabilitation in South Asia. In another, the same sum quietly redirected to what was labelled an anonymous endowment. But the destination was a trust registered in a Caribbean tax haven. And it wasn't alone. Over and over, Anne followed the ink trails, each leading to a darker corner of royal charity work that few dared to question. With every page, the scandal deepened. Anne wasn't just looking at careless bookkeeping, she was staring at what looked like deliberate concealment. Money that was raised in the name of duty and compassion had been funneled into entities that left no public footprint, shell organizations abroad. Subcontracted charity partners with vague missions and overlapping directors. External advisors whose connections to the crown raised eyebrows even in the most loyal circles. And there, scrawled in abbreviated initials, were names she recognized not just from within the palace, but from those around it. Long-trusted financial handlers, family-aligned solicitors, even distant nobles with private investment ties. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. And Anne had suspected it long before this ledger landed on her desk. That's why, months earlier, she had quietly hired a private investigator, an outsider with no royal affiliation, no allegiance to the crown, and no fear of uncovering the truth. What he found validated her worst fears. The ledger wasn't isolated. It was the center of a web that, when mapped, pointed to an unaccounted sum that ballooned past £12 million. All of it disguised in public-facing audits as redistributed funding or administrative variance. But in private, it was something far more corrosive. Anne now had in her hands what few in the monarchy had ever dared to confront. Evidence not just of mishandled money, but of a quiet betrayal. A corruption not of power, but of purpose. The royal foundation, once the emblem of benevolence, now sat at the heart of something potentially criminal. But Anne didn't panic. She didn't rage. She moved with precision, because the next phase wasn't about paper, it was about people, those inside the monarchy who still held honor above fear, duty above convenience. She didn't need to bring the house down to reveal the rot. She needed allies. And one by one, she started gathering them. But Anne wasn't just collecting evidence, she was building allies inside the monarchy, one at a time. Anne didn't go to the press. She went to the people who still believed in the soul of the monarchy. Sophie, Edward, the Duke of Gloucester, allies with clean hands and something else, access to restricted archival storage. In the quiet corners of Windsor, after official events had ended and the eyes of the world had turned elsewhere, a meeting took place without ceremony but with staggering consequence. Anne didn't bring accusations. She brought evidence, and what unfolded between them wasn't scandal, it was strategy. Sophie listened carefully, eyes trained not just on the documents Anne laid out, but on what they implied. Edward, characteristically silent at first, eventually spoke with weight. They needed more, not speculation, not theory. Proof buried in ink and paper. Records too old for digital audit trails, too sensitive to be included in standard reviews. That was when Edward remembered the key. A small, unremarkable piece of metal once used during their father's time, a key to a document room within Windsor, known to only a few. Its location wasn't secret, but what it held had always been selectively guarded. Files from past reigns, sealed communications, and archival records not accessible without direct clearance. And in that room, they found letters, dozens of them, some handwritten, some typed, but all marked with Charles's signature or bearing the imprint of his personal correspondence. They were addressed not to government officials or charity executives, but to an unnamed intermediary, someone referenced only as the external facilitator. The contents weren't explicit in wrongdoing, but they carried the unmistakable stench of obfuscation. Repeated reassurances about smoothing transfers, quiet routing, and ensuring discretionary flexibility. Each phrase, a blade sharpened by implication. The most damning letter, dated 3 years prior, referenced a donation meant for a youth education initiative. It noted delays in processing and the need for private coordination away from operational optics. Anne didn't need translation. Neither did Sophie. But Sophie, ever the realist, issued the warning they'd all been thinking. If this gets out, Camilla will bury it in distraction. The Queen's ability to manipulate press cycles was no secret. She didn't need to refute allegations, she only needed to change the conversation. And if that meant sacrificing relationships, reputations, or even members of the wider family, so be it. That was the battlefield they were stepping into. But retreat wasn't an option anymore, so they made a pact, not to leak, not to accuse, but to build a case strong enough that even the king himself couldn't dismiss it. They would move in silence, verify every link in the chain, and prepare not a rebellion but a reckoning. They weren't looking to destroy the monarchy. They were trying to save its soul before it collapsed under the weight of its own silence. But while Anne and her allies gathered truth, someone else began erasing it. Just as whispers about the charity accounts began circulating among palace staff, Queen Camilla made an announcement, a surprise public appearance, a symbolic coronation of goodwill, and a conveniently timed media blitz. But the timing was too perfect. Overnight, headlines shifted. The Queen Consort, smiling among schoolchildren, was framed as the face of modern royalty, compassionate, relatable, renewed. The press fixated on her message of literacy and outreach, a campaign meticulously timed to align with one of the very foundations now under scrutiny. But behind the curtain, something far more calculated was unfolding. Journalists with long-standing connections to the royal rota privately revealed their pitches were being stonewalled. Proposals to investigate irregularities in royal charities were returned with silence or subtle warnings from editors' hints that certain stories were not a good fit right now. It was never an explicit gag order. It didn't have to be. The power of the firm has always been suggestion, not declaration. Then came the chilling confession. A former aide, no longer bound by proximity but still shrouded in anonymity, admitted what many had suspected. "There's a media freeze," they said. Not official, but enforced all the same. Their words travelled fast through the undercurrent of palace watchers and internal loyalists. Camilla, it seemed, wasn't just reacting, she was orchestrating. She urged Charles to move quickly, to unveil new patronages, to speak of progress, of unity, of duty. It was a tactic long used by the Windsors, drown suspicion in ceremonial distraction. But this time, something was off. As Camilla's smile made its rounds in the morning papers, Princess Anne was staring at a screen in disbelief. Files she had bookmarked, archival records tied to the Foundation's overseas grants, were gone, not relocated, not revised, erased. And with them, critical timestamps and ledger entries that had formed the backbone of her private investigation. Anne was no stranger to royal damage control. But this wasn't containment, it was concealment. The kind executed not out of panic, but precision. What Anne didn't know yet was that a second operation was moving beneath her, one that involved senior communications staff, carefully selected palace briefings, and direct pressure applied to media desks with promises of exclusive access in return for compliance. It was no longer a quiet tension between siblings. It was a cold, calculated war of narrative. But for all of Camilla's efforts to control the stage, she overlooked one thing: the unpredictability of a leak. Because while stories can be delayed, files can be deleted, and headlines can be rewritten, a single document in the wrong hands can dismantle months of strategy. But no amount of media misdirection could prepare the palace for what happened next: a leaked file and a global headline. The Guardian, The Times, BBC, all hit with the same story within hours. Millions missing in royal charity accounts, insider source confirms. The leak wasn't just devastating, it was precise, and it was traced back to someone no one expected. Within minutes, the story exploded across every major news outlet. Screens lit up with the same chilling words: royal fraud, internal cover-up, donor betrayal. The documents were damning financial records cross-referenced with redacted internal memos, email threads dating back to 2021, and account summaries that told a starkly different story than the one previously released by Charles's official foundation. There were footnotes, attachments, and even internal timestamps proving the documents hadn't been altered post-leak. This wasn't speculation. It was evidence. The monarchy had weathered scandals before: personal feuds, affairs, even abdications. But this was different. This cut through the public's romanticized image of nobility and struck at something far more fragile: trust. Overnight, social media erupted. Donors who had proudly supported royal-led causes began publicly withdrawing their endorsements. Prominent philanthropists issued joint statements calling for an independent audit. Hashtags surged. Parliament members quietly began asking questions. The palace, unprepared and unarmed, scrambled to control a narrative that was already spiraling out of their grasp. Communications teams were deployed. Emergency meetings were called. And still silence from Charles. As the days stretched on, his refusal to engage began to look less like dignity and more like guilt. Behind the scenes, the corridors of Buckingham trembled. Staff who once wore their loyalty like armor now moved with visible unease. Internal phone logs were pulled, emails quietly reviewed. It didn't take long before the name surfaced: the former palace comptroller, a man known for his meticulous standards and icy discretion. He had left his position quietly the year before, citing personal reasons. Now, sources confirmed it was his hand that delivered the files. Not to tabloids, not to fringe outlets, but to the core of Britain's journalistic establishment. And the message was clear: this wasn't about revenge, this was about integrity. The Guardian confirmed they had been approached through secure channels. The documents, reviewed by forensic accountants, had already begun to hold up under scrutiny. The Queen Consort's media campaign collapsed under the weight of hard facts. Public goodwill drained. Even traditionally sympathetic voices within the press began shifting tone, asking what the palace knew and when. The timing of the leak left no room for spin, only reckoning. Royal aides tried to mount a last-ditch effort to present a narrative of confusion, of complex accounting. But the damage was already done. The illusion of infallibility shattered. Donor funds, earmarked for causes as noble as childhood education and veterans' rehabilitation, were found rerouted, some into trusts, others through shell organizations no longer traceable. The monarchy was bleeding credibility by the hour, and Charles, once seen as a stabilizing force, now appeared trapped in the very system he had spent decades preserving. Now, under global scrutiny, Charles had one option left: face the council Anne had built, or let the monarchy fracture. The setting was Windsor Castle. The moment was history in the making. Anne stood firm, documents in hand, flanked by Sophie, Edward, and a silent but watchful Princess of Wales. Charles had summoned them, but it was Anne who spoke first. The air in the chamber was thick with calculation. What had been framed as a conciliatory gathering quickly sharpened into something far more consequential. Anne, unflinching, presented what could no longer be ignored: ledgers marked with altered entries, transfers processed through shell accounts, names of intermediaries who had already begun cooperating with private investigators. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about proof. And she delivered it not as a daughter or a sister, but as a steward of the Crown's integrity. Edward remained silent, his presence alone a signal of unity. Sophie nodded once, as Anne laid the pages before them. Then, in a moment that shifted the tone from confrontation to declaration, Catherine stepped forward with a prepared statement signed by a half-dozen royal patronages, each calling for transparency, each signalling they would no longer offer blind allegiance without answers. Charles listened, not passively but with a quiet storm building beneath his restrained exterior. He did not deny the figures, nor did he discredit the sources, but he refused to confess culpability. His words were measured, chosen with the care of a monarch still grasping for control. "We will review the accounts in full." It was a concession, but not a surrender. And then came Camilla. Her entrance, uninvited and ill-timed, drew instant tension. She spoke over Anne, raising questions about motives, loyalty, and optics. But this time, Charles didn't shield her. The chamber fell silent as Anne turned her gaze to her brother, and he gave the smallest nod. A royal aide approached Camilla and escorted her from the room. Then Anne delivered her final blow, not with rage, but with resolve. "If we don't fix this ourselves, Parliament will. And when that happens, we won't be negotiating terms, we'll be answering subpoenas." Her words hung in the air like a judgment already rendered. She wasn't threatening the monarchy. She was trying to preserve what was left of it. And for the first time, Charles didn't have a retort. He looked at each of them, his sister, his brother, his daughter-in-law, and saw not a coup, but a reckoning long overdue. A line had been drawn, and he now stood on the edge of it. But the final reckoning wouldn't come in a room full of royals. It would come through a single act of public accountability. For the first time in royal history, Buckingham Palace issued a financial correction. The statement didn't name names, it didn't assign blame, but it did something far more important: it acknowledged the failure. And the monarchy would never be the same again. The correction, tucked within a midday press release, admitted to administrative inconsistencies and unaccounted endowments across several royal charitable accounts. It was a carefully measured phrase. But behind it was a storm that had taken months to break through layers of silence, secrecy, and institutional pride. This wasn't damage control. It was surrender, quiet, formal, and undeniable. The very act of public admission signaled what insiders already knew. The system had cracked from within. A full audit was ordered. Not just of Charles's primary foundation, but every royal charity under the Crown's banner. For the first time, the public would glimpse the inner mechanics of royal fundraising, distribution, and partnerships. Years of opaque transactions were about to face the light. And to mark the moment, Charles appeared in a pre-recorded address, seated, measured, every word reviewed by teams of advisors. Yet beneath the polish, there was a tone that hadn't been heard before weariness. "In service to this nation," he said, "we have at times trusted systems more than scrutiny. That was a mistake. One I acknowledge, and one we will correct." It was a concession, yes, but also a calculated attempt to stop the bleeding. Reaction was swift. Some called it brave, others branded it hollow. For critics, it was too late. For loyalists, it was enough. But in between the extremes, there was a name rising in public esteem: Princess Anne. Her refusal to stay silent, her persistence behind closed doors, and her visible restraint in not turning this into a media spectacle earned her something rarer than applause respect. Headlines from once cautious papers now read, "The quiet fixer of the crown and the woman who held the line." And beside her, not by accident, stood Catherine, Princess of Wales. The two women emerged together at a public hospital appearance days after the statement. Their unity said enough. The palace had spoken. The king had responded. The country had taken notice. But underneath the correction, behind the audit, and beyond the public calm, an unsettling question lingered. Documents had been erased. Files had gone missing. Influences had been used to stall, distract, and mislead. So even with a formal reckoning on record, a deeper truth threatened to rise. The palace had put out a statement, but had it told the full story? And yet, even after the statement, one question remained: how deep did the rot go? Beneath the gilded halls and public statements lies the vault, the one few ever access. That's where Anne's final documents were stored under lock and seal. What's inside remains confidential, but one insider said, if the public ever saw it, the crown would not survive it. After the correction, after the audit, after the appearances of unity and reform, this is where the true aftermath lived. In silence. The Windsor Archive had long been the final resting place of delicate truths, but this was different. What Anne placed inside wasn't just paperwork, it was legacy, it was evidence. It was the story no press conference would ever tell, protected by layers of legal safeguards, co-signed only by one man, Prince Edward. The documents were sealed in a private royal ledger, an area not even subject to standard royal transparency laws. And that decision was no accident. The reasoning was brutal and simple. Exposure would devastate the crown's remaining credibility. Not just because of the money, but because of what the mishandling represented: favoritism, deception, the misuse of public empathy. Whispers swirled around the palace, claiming the full list of beneficiaries tied to the diverted funds had never been revealed publicly. That there were names outside the family, within the inner circle, maybe even beyond UK borders, that would cause a national scandal if exposed. And that's why those names were never included in the audit. The monarchy had bent just far enough to survive, but it had no intention of breaking. Still, the aftermath could not be controlled entirely. A new set of private finance protocols were introduced under the guise of modernization. Behind closed doors, the system was being rebuilt brick by brick to prevent another unraveling. But even as reforms rolled out, the silence around the missing documents grew louder. Tabloids began speculating about unpublished memoirs, insiders hinting that several royals, former aides, even distant cousins, had begun writing their accounts. Journalists received tips, promises were made, threats were exchanged. But Anne? She vanished from the media entirely. She gave no interviews, no press tours, not even a speech to commemorate the audit's conclusion. All that remained was a single, handwritten note left with her archivist. Just 10 words that told the entire story. This was never about money, it was about trust. And that was the wound that never fully healed. Not the funds, not the reputations, but the breach of trust. The unspoken contract between a monarchy and its people that honour, not power, sat at the heart of it all. In the public eye, the monarchy held. It did not fall. But inside its walls, it cracked. Cracks no appearance or statement could fully mend. And from those cracks, something began to rise, quiet, steady. A force not born from scandal, but from resistance to it. A legacy forged not in ceremony, but in truth. Not draped in power, but cloaked in principle. A different kind of royal. A different kind of future. Carrying the name Princess Anne. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.